television first tonight, the new questions we need to be asking about Jeffrey Epstein. Because nobody else really is asking these questions, and when you do ask, you don't get answers. When you don't get answers, keep asking. He had effectively a double life, and we know very little about the bigger part of his life. We're not talking about the sex part here. The Wall Street Journal just reported that after Epstein's conviction on sex charges, schedules show meetings planned with William Burns, director of the CIA. Since 2021, he had 3 scheduled meetings with Epstein starting in 2014 when he's Deputy Secretary of State. Why is a Deputy Secretary of State meeting with a guy who had pleaded guilty to sex crimes involving minors? Catherine Rumler, a White House counsel under President Barack Obama, had dozens of meetings with Epstein in the years after her service in the White House. Leland Vittert, the president of Bard College, invited Epstein, who brought a group of young female guests to the campus. Noam Chomsky, professor, author, and political activist, was scheduled to fly with Epstein to have dinner at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse in 2015. We don't know which of these meetings took place. We do know they were scheduled. That's what the Wall Street Journal found. Ariane de Rothschild, who's now chief executive of the Swiss private bank Edmond de Rothschild Group, had more than a dozen meetings with Epstein. Epstein scheduled more than a dozen meetings from 2013 to 2017 with Joshua Cooper Ramo, who at the time served on the board of Starbucks and FedEx. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was reportedly a regular guest at Epstein's meetings. Epstein was scheduled to have dinner with them and movie director Woody Allen and his wife. Why? Sure, there are the accusations of sex with underage girls and the massages and all the sickening sex stuff that surrounded Jeffrey Epstein. That's largely been adjudicated. Nearly 24 of those women shared their stories in court after he died. But we know shockingly little about why the most powerful names in the world, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, Kevin Spacey, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and so many others, hung out with a relatively small potatoes money manager who appeared to enjoy the company of underage women. We still know very little about why people trusted him to manage their money, or why even after his sexual deviance became public, the rich and powerful felt the need to meet with him. Alan Dershowitz defended Epstein in that 2008 case that resulted in a year jail sentence. Epstein was originally accused of sexually abusing girls as young as 14. He pleaded guilty to a much lesser charge. But after that, think about that. After he pled guilty to being involved in some really unsavory activities, the world's most powerful and influential people couldn't get enough of Jeffrey Epstein. Alan Dershowitz joins us now, famed Harvard law professor and criminal defense attorney. It's good to see you, sir. I appreciate it. What is the power that Epstein had that got so many people to check their better judgment at the door?
Well, I think a number of factors. Before he pleaded guilty, which is when I knew him, nobody knew, as far as I know, nobody knew he had this secret life. The president of Harvard, many, many other people. He had seminars with Nobel Prize winners. They were interesting, and he was an interesting guy. Some people, I think, were attracted to him because of his intellect, because of his charm. I think he had some things over some other people. I think he had some extortion over some people. I think some people may have come to him not for his great financial advice. I never thought he was that good financially. I never took financial advice from him. And I suspect there were people over whom he had something involving the sex stuff. Now, the rest of us, we didn't know anything. There were no young women around when I was there as his lawyer. There were no pictures or anything of that kind. But once he was convicted, then a lot of people continued to hang around him. I had nothing to do with him once he was convicted. Yeah. I knew what he had done once I was his lawyer, and so I had nothing further to do with him. But other people continued to have things to do with him, and that's a real question. I don't think we yet know why, for example, Leslie Wexner allowed him to have counsel rights over all of his money, or other people like that. I think there's a lot yet that has to be known. He did lead completely secret lives. People who knew him early on, like George Mitchell and other people like that. I don't think they knew anything about his secret life. He kept it a complete and total secret. He had a special area of his house that nobody was allowed near. And but once he was convicted, people should have known, and they made judgments. Some people did it for entirely innocent purposes. He met with Fidel Castro. I was once at Caroline Kennedy's house. This is a name-dropping story. Having dinner with Bill Clinton, and he was president, and the Secret Service came over to Clinton, gave him a phone, and he went away for about 20 minutes. And then after the 20 minutes, he came back and handed me the phone and said, "It's Jeffrey Epstein. He wants to say hello."
Thanks for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to subscribe. Click the red button to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.